When you think about monsters, what images come to mind? Do you think of movies depicting vampires, zombies, Godzilla, or extraterrestrials? Or are you more inclined to think about beings like Bigfoot, dogmen, serpent-like creatures in the water, or other strange, shadowy figures that countless people swear reside in the darkest corners of the earth? It's said that even the wildest fiction is born from some level of truth. It's one thing to share a creepy story around a campfire, but it's quite another when ordinary people go out of their way to report encounters with things that change their lives. It's all too easy to blame misidentification, imagination, or even hoaxes. However, are we really supposed to believe that these things account for every reported sighting or encounter? A large portion of those who come forward are experienced outdoorsmen. They already know what a bear looks like. They know the terrain. They're very familiar with the local wildlife. So why go to such great lengths to endure the ridicule and disbelief they'll get if they're not absolutely certain that what they've seen isn't normal? Of course, just about any animal in the woods can take us by surprise under the right conditions. The thing is, though, ordinary animals don't usually alter our perceptions of reality, do they? If you stumble upon a bear, a wolf, maybe next time you go out, you make sure you're more prepared and have a better idea what to look for, but those aren't exactly paradigm-shifting experiences. People aren't forced to venture outside of their comfort zones and start researching cryptids after seeing a typical or even somewhat rare animal. I think that it's likely that many sightings, maybe even most, can be explained by misperception, inexperience, fear, or possibly just the tricks that lights and shadows play on us. However, I'm of the opinion that there are some very anomalous exceptions. The wealth of information supports this, as do experienced researchers and scientists. To think that we've discovered every animal, life form, or phenomenon on planet Earth is both arrogant and foolish. Today's guest has been investigating such cases for a long time, and there aren't many bigger names in the field of cryptid research than Lyle Blackburn. Lyle's authored several books depicting many different types of cryptids. He's collaborated with Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters by producing and narrating numerous documentaries. The guy's been on all sorts of TV programs. So chances are many of you are familiar with his work, and I'm extremely excited to have him on the program today. Lyle has a great new book out titled Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire. And of course, the focus here is strange phenomena in and around different swamps and wetland areas across the U.S. In addition to the cryptid stories you'd expect, though, the book also covers other things like UFOs, hauntings, spook lights, that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely a superb read. Lyle has a real knack for detail. He's a great storyteller and an amazing writer. I think you guys will really enjoy this one. And it's been a while since we've done a good cryptid-focused episode here on the Aether, and I'm confident this one will be by far the most memorable and entertaining. So sit back and get comfortable, my friends. We've got Lyle Blackburn right after this. Hey, Lyle, how are you, sir?
Good.
Good, man. I thank you so much for coming on the program. Really a pleasure to have you. I am a big fan.
Oh, no problem. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Texas in July, huh? I imagine your AC is probably working overtime right about now.
Yeah. It's been hot, pretty hot for the last couple of weeks, big time.
Right. Yeah, I lived in North Texas myself for 10 years. And honestly, I miss the water parks and the swimming pools probably the most. Moving over to the Pacific Northwest, it's really only hot here for about maybe a month or two out of the year. So still an adjustment I'm trying to get used to, I guess.
Yeah, that's a big change.
Definitely. Well, I usually like to start with an origin story, which I'm sure you're used to by now.
Sure.
But in the intro of your latest book, Sinister Swamps, you mention a trip that you and your family took to Silver Springs in the Everglades of Florida. It sounds like that had a pretty big impact on you. But what were some of the other early factors that led you to investigating cryptids and the paranormal?
Well, all in there as a child, I loved monster movies, horror movies, anything to do with monsters. And then at some point, I discovered Bigfoot and Yeti stories. I got a book when I was in school, like a Strange But True type book, and
Mhm.
read about the Loch Ness monster and things. That's the first time I can remember hearing about cryptids, and that sort of captured my imagination because I thought, wow, these could be real, not just something on, in a monster makeup or costume. So that was the first time. And then somewhere in there, I saw the Patterson Gimlin film and then saw the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, which was a southern Sasquatch creature much closer to me in Texas. So with all that, that's kind of where it started. And then, the trip that I describe in my new book about going to Florida and the swamps and the Everglades, of course, all that just sort of tied in with adventure and, alligators in the swamp and having seen Tarzan movies. So all of that just sort of played up to an appreciation for beastly things in the woods and swamps and my fascination with creatures that are, said to not exist or to be big and monstrous.
hmm You've been at this a while and you cover quite a few areas in this book. If I'm not mistaken, it sounds like you've personally been to all or at least most of these regions. Is that true?
Most of them. There was a couple of swamps that I haven't been to, but quite a number of those I definitely have over the years. So the book, I kind of started the research of this book about 10 years ago, just kind of in my mind or just filing away stories that had to do with swamps. And in the process, I had visited many of these. So that kind of added an extra perspective on, the whole thing, because I could personally describe, being in those places.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely not an armchair researcher. That is for sure. I can't stress how rare that is in this genre. Most people just find what they can on the internet or in books and then write about it. I'm guilty of that myself. A lot of us just don't have either the time or the resources to travel that extensively. So I'm really excited to pick your brain. It's been on my to-do list for a while. And I also wanted to stress for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with your work, you're not just a Bigfoot guy. You research any and all cryptids as well as paranormal stuff, even UFOs. Before we dive into your book here, I wanted to ask you, do you have a favorite cryptid or subject that you feel, I guess, more personally drawn to?
I would say Bigfoot is probably my number one.
Okay.
And part of that being that in my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, had to do with the infamous Legend of Boggy Creek, Southern Sasquatch story in southern Arkansas. So I was always kind of that. And when you come out with a book that has to do with Bigfoot first, and having been associated with going to Bigfoot conferences and things, people, of course, kind of cite you in as a Bigfoot guy. But truly, I just like all spooky stories and all things monstrous, especially reports of, coming from people saying they saw something that couldn't be explained in modern times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's such a wide variety of crazy stories out there. It's hard to zero in on just one aspect of them. So I definitely get that. The first chapter focuses on an area in the Bridgewater Triangle. I've heard that name quite a few times over the years, but I never really took a good look at it until after I read your book. I understand it is a 200 square mile area south of Boston that's home to a lot of unusual activity, goes back a ways. Can you start with maybe just giving us a few bullet points on this area and how it acquired the name Bridgewater Triangle?
Yeah, definitely. The swamp I focus on there is the Hockomock Swamp, which is in Massachusetts, and it is a part of a greater area identified as the Bridgewater Triangle. And that was coined by cryptozoologist Loren Coleman some years ago. And since then, a lot of researchers have put in more hours of research and kind of, reinforced that area in Massachusetts does have a lot of unexplained paranormal activity, not just cryptids or UFOs. I mean, there's ghosts, there's every sort of thing you can possibly imagine. So in my focus, of course, there's a portion of that called the Hockomock Swamp. And within that swampy area, you have stories dating back to Native Americans who talked of, great flying beasts and birds and, mischievous type entities that live there. And then in modern times, people reported seeing large, unexplained canids. They weren't quite dog, not quite wolf, looked hyena-like. You have tales of some of these dogs, having killed horses and other things, and the citizens organized hunts. Of course, tales of giant snakes. There is a significant history of a Bigfoot-like creature roaming in Hockomock that had been researched quite a bit, especially back in the 70s and 80s. A lot of reports, newspaper coverage, and a lot of these swamps have sort of the ubiquitous Bigfoot and so forth.
Yeah.
There were pterosaurs, pterodactyl type creatures. People had seen strange lights, and probably one of the most notable, especially because of reader feedback so far, that there's something called the Pukwudgie, and a guy named Bill Russo saw a creature which stood about 4 feet tall. It was covered in hair. It had a protruding belly, kind of big eyes, and he ran across this one evening while walking near the Hockomock Swamp, and this thing appeared to be beckoning him to come into this sort of circle of bluish light that came down from a mercury lamp there. And that's one of the things that is kind of chilling, because some of the Native American tales talked of this Pukwudgie, which was a mischievous kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, sort of a creature that, could be good or could be bad.
Mm-hmm.
And what Bill Russo saw in recent times kind of fit that description. So it kind of came full circle. But that's basically all, a gist of what has come out of Hockomock itself.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the Russo story. I was going to ask you about this one, actually. The Pukwudgie I find pretty intriguing. It makes me draw some comparisons to fairy lore, at least in terms of someone or something inviting people to follow them, eat or drink something, the trickster element leading people astray, that sort of thing. Do you find that these aspects come up very often when researching this stuff, or no?
Not a lot. I mean,
okay.
Probably because I primarily have concentrated on cryptids so far, and a lot of those you very rarely have any sort of interaction, I would say. I mean, and a lot of people, of course, tell stories of Bigfoot being quite friendly or benevolent, but never sort of beckoning you, not like this Pukwudgie story. Now, ghostly figures and things, you often run across, that sort of thing. But I think you really got to get out into really more unexplainable paranormal territory to where you get some kind of interaction, or it seems that the creature may be beckoning you. But a lot of these are simply just these, creatures that are seen, roaming the swamps, and they slip back into the shadows quickly thereafter.
Yeah, exactly. It seems for the most part, a lot of these creatures are pretty indifferent to humans. They may acknowledge our presence, but attacks on humans seem fairly rare. The giant wolf encounter on Skinwalker Ranch definitely comes to mind. And speaking of canines, I'm curious about the phantom black dog like creature. It was spotted just a few years ago by a correctional officer out driving near Hockomock Swamp. But you also mentioned a report that came from a firefighter in 1976. Can you talk just a little bit about those two encounters and what makes those similar?
Yes. So, yeah, I kind of lead off with a report I got in person from a gentleman who worked at a correctional facility in Massachusetts and required him. He got off work late, like 11 p.m. or midnight, and had to drive through the Hockomock Swamp area. And just one occasion, he was driving, and this dog-like thing ran across the road in front of him. And he's the only one out there on the road that, late at night. And it wasn't a coyote, not a wolf. It was larger, had dark fur, almost a body like a hyena. It ran on all fours, and it was standing perhaps 7 feet. It was huge, and it was a canid that he just couldn't quite identify. And while he wasn't able to observe it for a long period of time because it simply bounded across the road, it shook him up enough that he stopped the car and watched this thing run off into the woods. And he was a good witness, someone I talked to a couple of times, and seemed quite sincere, and was just sort of trying to wrap his head around what it is he had seen. And that kind of was a perfect lead off to Hockomock, because they had stories in the past, dating back in the 1970s, especially, of this huge black killer dog that stalked the area and had killed two ponies. And a firefighter went out, and saw this creature in the midst of ripping the throats out of his horses, and it ran off into the woods. And then following that, the police were getting a lot of calls from people who had seen this big, huge dog thing.
Right.
And like they do in most of this, the authorities kind of dismiss it. Well, it's a German Shepherd or whatever on the loose. But people were, they weren't calling because they had seen a German Shepherd. They were calling because they were scared this was some unknown thing. And, the police went out and searched and ended up, never able to find it. Eventually, one of the policemen fired on it with a 12-gauge shotgun, and it sort of just ran off into the woods and was never reported again. So who knows what it was, but it just kind of reinforces that these swampy areas, especially, you get these glimpses of these strange creatures, and they may be there for a while and may be observed, but they slip back into the shadows, and nobody can really quite explain what it is they were.
Yeah, and whatever that thing was, it sounds like it's possibly been there quite a long time. And with such a recent encounter like that, very well could still be alive and well today. When reading through your chapter on the Honey Island swamp monster in Louisiana, something stood out to me. Though there are some obvious similarities there between this particular creature and Bigfoot, there were some notable differences too. Can you speak to those differences, and what factors do you think might play a role in those if you had to speculate?
Yeah, Honey Island is one that I was looking forward to covering in this book, because I've covered it in some regards in perspective of Bigfoot in some of my other books, because it's kind of a Bigfoot-like creature and often gets lumped into that category. But truly, the descriptions, a lot of folks' descriptions of it didn't seem to line up with Bigfoot. I mean, it was, yes, it stood upright, 7 feet tall, covered in hair, but some of the original witnesses, Harlan Ford and Billy Mills, said it had more slender legs, and it had a kind of a broad chest, and when it took off, it seemed to run and possibly, go on all fours. I don't know, but later on they they came across what they said were probably footprints of this creature, and these things had only 3 toes and looked a little bit reptilian, almost alligator-like. And none of that kind of adds up to quite to the jive with Pacific Northwest type Bigfoot, although the 3-toed thing does start playing into the southern Bigfoot, because the Fouke monster or the Boggy Creek monster, as I've written about frequently, also said to have 3 toes. So, and that's kind of gets associated with southern Sasquatch as if they have, all these creatures have 3 toes, which isn't quite right.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the witness descriptions of the Honey Island swamp monster, several witnesses saw that it was in water. It was getting out of water, walking around, and typically, ape-like primates don't swim or like water. So that was unique as well, and sort of plays into this more swampy version of Bigfoot, something that is like it, but definitely just off-center. And so within my discussion in Sinister Swamps about the Honey Island swamp monster, I really was able to cover the entire history, out regardless of whether it was a Bigfoot or not. It's just simply a swamp that is extremely associated with this particular creature.
Right. And, with any life form, it's going to adapt to its environment over time. And I've always kind of wondered if that was the case with cryptids and other similar things as well. So definitely something to think about there. The next area I'd like to cover is Okefenokee. Now, this is a huge 700 square mile swath of wetland and wilderness in southern Georgia. And obviously an area that big is going to have some history, everything from planes mysteriously vanishing there to legends of an ancient Mayan civilization. I thought that one was really interesting, to, of course, cryptids. And the story of Man Mountain definitely got my attention. Apparently, this one wasn't very indifferent at all. In 1829, 9 hunters from Florida were said to have shot and killed a large Bigfoot-type creature, but not before it killed 5 members of their hunting party by, quote, twisting their heads from their necks. Definitely a dramatic story, and it did make the local paper, but surprisingly, there was an interesting find unearthed in that area later in 1969. Can you talk about what was allegedly found there?
Yeah, that Man Mountain story is interesting in the Okefenokee because it's one of the earliest records of a newspaper reporting what we would kind of equate to Bigfoot these days.
Right.
And so, of course, in that case, it was not just somebody saw a Bigfoot, but they had a confrontation and some guys got, killed, and they, shoot it and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very dramatic story, but one that, kind of jibes with modern reports of people seeing huge, Bigfoot-like creatures in the swamp. And then later, in modern times, there's a place called Chesser Island, and there's some mounds. There's a lot of mounds in these swamps, Native American burial sites and so forth. And they unearthed some skeletons out there that were piled up, and they were huge, according to these reports. They were just not your average size human, though they looked mostly like human. The jawbones were huge. It had their teeth, and these teeth were huge. And, that just sort of, again, you get modern reports that kind of reflect back, and you start scratching your head and you say, well, maybe there were creatures, or maybe there are creatures that exist out there that, we just don't quite have proof, and we're trying to make sense of the puzzle pieces, but all these kind of things kind of line up. Giant skeletons, tales of, a giant, upright walking hominid. So interesting stuff.
Yes, definitely. And it makes me wonder, with all the giant skeletons reported to have been found over the years all over the world, where are they today? Why aren't they on display somewhere? Are they being covered up? Have they been destroyed? It's just another one of those really big mysteries. But moving on to your home state of Texas here, one of your chapters talks about the Thing of Autine Swamp just south of Austin. This particular place is what you refer to in the book as a relict ecosystem. So it's a 12,000-year-old self-sustaining confined area that really doesn't resemble its surroundings at all. Definitely a perfect backdrop for strange creatures. In fact, parts of the 2010 Predators movie were filmed there, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Robert Rodriguez, the filmmaker, lives in Texas and did a lot of filming here. So they actually used, if you think about it, there's Texas, and they found a place that looked so much like an alien planet that they had filmed most of that, I believe, in Hawaii.
Yeah.
That it stood in for that. That's how weird that area is. And the first time I went there, you just drive across sort of your typical central Texas kind of flat. There's trees, but there's no necessarily forest. They're kind of sparse, and all of a sudden you come to this sort of lush area that has palmetto trees and swampy looking landscape and a lot of water. It just totally stands out like an alien planet, really.
Yeah, exactly. In the book, you talk about how the place looks so prehistoric. You could sit back and not be surprised if a dinosaur came sauntering out of there. And funny enough, the thing in this case shares an unusual trait with the predator creature. It's reported to possibly have what we might call a cloaking ability. I thought that was a really cool coincidence, but this gets reported all the time with cryptids, and I can't help but draw some parallels to elementals and egregores. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. I'm sure that you've pondered this before.
Yeah, certainly. And in the Aether swamp monster, again, it's one of those that kind of fits the general description of a Bigfoot-like creature. It's dark and hairy and walks upright. It's human-like, yet primitive. But in this case, a lot of the witnesses claim that in some cases it was there and they couldn't see it, or it was just sort of a black shape. And that kind of gets into that debate about whether, Bigfoot has any sort of cloaking ability. Does it have, any sort of supernatural or paranormal characteristics? And, a lot of my thoughts on that, and a lot of the Bigfoot, just your general Bigfoot reports, is that people often underestimate animals. I mean, their whole construction, the way their fur is shaded and contrasted, it's meant to conceal and camouflage them. I mean, animals can, panthers and other things, I mean, they can practically walk right by you, and you possibly have walked by them in the past, but they've so concealed in the shadow, you just simply can't see them. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times I don't know if it requires supernatural ability if these creatures are, able to, blend into their environment and are experts at it. It's staying, undocumented, then that could explain it. But in the case of the Aether swamp monster, definitely it seemed like that was more in the realm of paranormal to me, just simply because you had numerous sort of legends and reports saying that it, most people thought it had some sort of ability to be invisible or cloak. So, that's unique and also just weird. You can't make this stuff up that they later filmed a Predator movie there, which has literally that, that alien has that ability. It's like, that's just weird. I don't know how to explain any of that stuff, but it just makes for fascinating reading,
Absolutely. Yeah. When I read that, I was like, really? And I had to go and look that up for myself right away. And sure enough, yeah, they filmed parts of that movie there. And I was blown away that they would have such a specific, well-known thing in common like that. One of those art imitating life things, I suppose. But what about you, man? And in all the experiences you've had, all the places you've gone to, have you ever witnessed something that you can't explain?
As far as cryptids, I've never definitively seen something I could say was a Bigfoot or, anything like that. I've been in circumstances where I think possibly they were there or just out of sight. Once in Arkansas, in the Boggy Creek area, where something was howling at us and trailed us down the swamp, and I couldn't quite get it in in the beam of my flashlight, though I ran down and tried. And then another instance in Florida where a big, huge something was running just ahead of me out of sight as I also literally plunged into the woods and tried to get a glimpse of it. And those both followed either a howl, and the one in Florida followed what I thought sounded like, and I did find this can laying there, but it sounded like something was literally hitting on a can, like, and then that's what drew my attention. And as soon as I went and ducked into the woods to see what it was, this thing took off. And they do have bears in this particular area, but I didn't quite think it was a bear, nor would a bear probably be hitting on a can. But
right.
Other than that, when I was younger, I saw a ghost, or what people would, define as a ghost, sort of a whitish human form that walked across the foyer in a friend of mine's home.
Interesting.
And he had seen it, his parents had seen it, and several of my friends had seen it prior to me seeing it. And I was sitting there one evening and not even thinking anything about it, and waiting for him to get ready so we could go out. And I saw this thing walk right across from the den to the hallway towards the bedrooms. And I'm like, oh man, I just saw the ghost, it was just like that in an instant. So that was sort of I would say that's probably my most paranormal thing that's happened. Although I'm sort of a cryptid hunter guy, I have seen a ghost.
Well, not only that, other people saw it too. So it does add some mystery and some credibility to that. Would you like to see a cryptid? Do you think that might validate these phenomena more for you?
Yeah, certainly so. I mean, and I mean, my whole goal has never been to prove or to necessarily see them myself. I'm sort of I document the legends and stories and interview people. I'm an investigative journalist as much as I am an outdoors adventurer. So, but of course, within that, sure, I definitely, if I could even see one, that would really, solidify in my mind that these things are out there. Now, while there's many credible witnesses, and I surely believe that they saw something unusual, and I certainly believe that there's probably there's things out there that we don't have proof of until you really see it yourself. I mean, then that's the the smoking gun. You can say, well, whether people believe you or not, I'd say I saw it, so I know. And then on top of that, if I did find some proof or came across something that was that dramatic, even better. I mean,
sure.
So, I'm always got my eyes open to all those things, and I go, and if I interview people or if I'm out there exploring or searching, I go to where people say they've seen these things. I try to put myself in the most likely place to be able to observe one myself.
Yeah. And well, with all the places you travel and like you said, putting yourself where the action is, so to speak, I think it would only be a matter of time before you catch a glimpse of something. But I'm glad you mentioned ghosts there, because that's a perfect segue to where we're headed. The last story I wanted to touch on hails from the Congaree National Park near Columbia, South Carolina. And that is the legend of Swamp Lady. As the story goes here, I'll kind of just summarize this one. A husband and wife are driving out in that area toward Columbia and see a well-dressed woman on the side of the road. They figure she's in some kind of trouble, so they pull over and offer her a ride. She gets in the back seat and gives them an address. The wife then asks the woman a question shortly after that and gets no reply. Of course, she turns around to see that the woman's gone, leaving behind, some kind of a strange vapor or mist in the back seat. The wife loses her shit, and her husband actually has to take her to the ER in Columbia. After this, the husband then drives to the address the woman gave earlier. Once he gets there, he's told by an older woman that they're not the first to show up with a story of a vanishing lady. She tells him the woman they picked up is her sister, who died in a car accident a number of years ago while driving through the swamp. You have all kinds of stories about specters, disembodied voices, apparitions, and things like that throughout the book that take place in these areas. So I'm not a big believer in coincidence. Therefore, I have to wonder why. What is it about these areas that make them home to so many strange phenomena? Have you developed any theories about that? Are we just giving these places power by feeding into them, or do you think there could be more to it than that?
Well, yeah, that's certainly one of the questions I asked myself as I went through the research and writing of this book. Swamps themselves, just have a certain ambiance, and we have a certain idea of what they are. And, anytime, a movie or cartoon needs a spooky environment, they always, put it in a swamp.
Yeah.
And swamps have, all these swamps have legends and stories of all sorts of weird and spooky stuff dating back as far as recorded history goes. And, you just wonder, well, when you're in a swamp, are you, have a preconceived notion, and any shadow then becomes ghostly, or any shadow becomes a monster, or by nature of these environments, which are often the most undeveloped areas, they are perilous places where not as many people are roaming around. This is a place where creatures, or even sort of paranormal entities, could find a sanctuary. I mean, this is sort of the shadows of our society. And so on that, it could very well be just that, if a creature like Bigfoot, for example, if a population of those needed to, wanted to stay away from contact with humans, well, that's a great place to live. And then perhaps you have a hunter or other people who do go in the swamp. They run across and get a glimpse of some of these creatures. The ghostly stories, I mean, sometimes in these swamps, like Hockomock Swamp and a few others, the places you can't explain. There's so much bizarre activity that you can almost begin to see things that are like the Bridgewater Triangle, where it's just an area that just has this unusual amount of bizarre stuff. And, many researchers before me have grappled with trying to explain it. And, in terms of simply a cryptid or a creature, it's almost easier to explain because, that's where animals hide and live, and there's plenty of food and sustenance, so easy to survive. But when you start getting into more like, okay, spook lights and ghostly apparitions, how do you explain all that? It becomes this giant question of trying to explain almost like every paranormal type of scenario in one, because these swamps just contain so much of it. So I don't really have any definitive answers, and my opinions on it are just that it's probably a little bit of both. It's a shadowy place, and our imaginations can go wild, but at the same time, it's a place where strange things do happen, and there could be, some certain thing about that land, or something that has captured forces and things going on that we simply don't quite understand, even with our modern science. So the answers are still eluding us, but the more I document these, the more you kind of start seeing the patterns and how these things line up, and how generation after generation people are seeing the same kind of phenomenons over and over.
Yeah, good answer, and good observation too. A lot of people tend to call these places window areas or hot spots, but I've been wondering this forever. What makes the veil so thin between realities in certain locations? Is it the history? Is it because maybe not as many people reside in these places, but then they also happen in more populous areas too? So a lot of dots to connect there. But the last question I have for you is one that I like to ask everybody who investigates unexplained phenomena. In all your travels, all your research, the people you've interviewed, what have you come away with a greater understanding of? The phenomena or yourself?
I would say the phenomenon. I mean, I've kind of remained the same. In the beginning of this book where I described me as 10 years old or whatever, going to Florida and seeing a swamp. I'm literally the same I'm literally the same, just the monster kid and fascinated with all these. And within that, having the luxury of being able to research this as an adult, I've understood the phenomenon much more and also realized that, number one, a lot more people have seen weird things than we first imagine. When you start looking into it, you realize there is just a lot of weird stuff that people are seeing. And then on top of that, there is just some unexplainable stories that you have to you can't just simply dismiss out of hand. You can't say, well, like person's he was drinking or he's just imagining. Now, I've interviewed too many really solid, credible witnesses that have stories or sightings that you just simply can't explain. And I can tell you they're not lying. They're not making it up. They themselves can't explain what they saw.
Right.
And so for those reasons, I've understand that this phenomenon is something that, though we can't quite explain it, it absolutely exists. And people are seeing these things from, unexplained creatures, or almost like you say, the windows of time where somebody sees a pterodactyl, or whether they're seeing ghosts or a phantom car in one case in one of these swamps. Just what is it? Is it a loop playing? Is it a vision or something captured? Is it a glimpse into another dimension? No way to tell. But I certainly have a better appreciation about all of this stuff and have learned that you just can't say, that's easy to explain. It's something this and this and this. No, it's much more complicated.
Yep, I would definitely have to agree with you there. I think at best, these answers are extremely complicated, but certainly worth looking for. I can't wait to see what you got coming up next, Lyle. Any new books or movies you're working on we should know about?
I do narration for Small Town Monsters films, and we've done, a number. I'm losing count, there's been 9 or 10, and I've narrated a number of those. But I just completed the narration for Mothman Legacy, which is the new movie coming out soon as a follow-up to our Mothman of Point Pleasant. So anybody that kind of has followed me probably has seen me in those movies or even the ones where I narrate. So that's exciting because I love the Mothman case, and this is our chance to expand on that. And I'm pretty much always working on something. So I do have another book that's in the works that I'm finishing up, and it's more of a case files of things, not exactly like some of the narratives I've done before.
Okay.
And then I have a whole list of it's become a problem where it's like I have a whole list of books that I think would be great, but I have to choose wisely because they take me usually about a year to complete. So, I really think about what am I going to do next. I think the more I do this, the more I come across really good stories or something that I think would make a good book. And then I'm like, okay, now how do I flip a coin here? How do I decide what to do next? That's been a problem.
Understood. And I saw the first movie you did on Mothman there with Seth Breedlove, like you'd mentioned, and it was incredible. So really excited to see the follow-up to that. Before we go here, I also have to tell people that you're the front man for the band Ghoultown. I myself was a huge fan the instant I saw your video for I Am the Night. You guys have an incredible sound, and if anybody out there is a fan of rock with some punk and horror and spaghetti western thrown in there, it really doesn't get much better than Ghoultown, I assure you. With all the COVID stuff going on, are you guys still able to get together and play very often or record any new music at all?
Well, yes, actually. And I kind of, that's a whole nother kind of aspect, but the band has recently, we were working on production of a new album, and we are actually in fact, we're doing something for the first time here, is doing a crowdfunding thing to provide a lot more options of what people can get, like, variations and vinyl and all this other stuff, by kind of putting it out there to see what the demand is first, rather than releasing albums as we have in the past and then just it's there and you buy it. But the shutdown or the COVID thing kind of didn't affect us much, because we were already about to do an album, which we had already rehearsed the songs. So we just, it just has to be the band members, and we go in and record. So we weren't doing any gigs or tours and any of that. So the problem, I think, will be down the line is, once this comes out in the fall, is, how to play shows, if that's possible. And you can't do your usual thing where we have this giant album release gig and do stuff like that. So the challenges will come up. But for now, we've been able to continue in the production and pre-production on the album. And our crowdfunding it only has like 11 days left, and it's already, I think it's 98% funded already.
Nice.
So it'll surely happen. And the demand is looking great, even in times of uncertainty. So we appreciate all of that. So.
Yeah, very cool. Well, speaking of band life, are you more of a fan of the recording process and coming up with new stuff, or playing live shows?
Definitely live shows.
Yeah.
That's always, the recordings are a little more, I don't know, pressure and work, it's like you've got to do it right. And by the time you get to the live show, you've rehearsed it, it, you get up there, you have fun, your fans are there, singing along and stuff. And that's a lot of fun. But, given that we there early on, I've been a touring musician almost right after high school. And, touring is it takes a lot, all these years being on the road. So that's one reason I took a break to write a book. And what happened is that turned into a whole nother career I had no idea about. I just wanted to write a book because I loved cryptids and wrote The Legend of Boggy Creek. So I had no intention on any of this, but this was fun, and it allowed me to kind of scale back the whole touring thing and to do something different, so, but still live shows are my favorite.
Gotcha. Yeah, there really is something about playing for a live audience that there's nothing quite like it. And the energy is just so contagious. I hope I get a chance to see you guys in person one day. That would be incredible. If anybody wants to go check out your work or your band, or just get in touch with you, where do they do that?
Just visit my website at Lyle Blackburn, Lyle Blackburn.com. And that has links to everything. So you can get links to where, you can go to my online store and buy autographed books, or there's links there to Amazon. All my stuff is, sold on Amazon. And there's a link to Ghoultown there, so you can find the band as well, and some other various things. But all the news is there. And I typically do a lot of appearances throughout the year at paranormal conferences and Bigfoot conferences and things. But obviously this year it's gotten chaotic and rather thin. There are a few that are still going on, unbelievably, but most of them have been canceled. So, but in the meantime, it gives me more time to write books and to, do interviews like this and to talk to people. So I'm always make the best use of the time.
Right on. Well, it's been amazing having you on, Lyle. I honestly wasn't that sure if I'd be able to convince you to make an appearance, but you were able to. You're a true gentleman. Your research is absolutely stellar. I implore my audience to check out your other books, the movies you've narrated and produced, your music. All of it's incredible. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it. And I hope to have you back on sometime in the future if you're willing.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate you having me on, and, good luck in the future with your podcast.
Much appreciated. Thanks again, Lyle. Take care.
Thank you.
I had a phenomenal time talking to our guest this week. Big thank you one last time to Mr. Lyle Blackburn. Such a down-to-earth guy, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather have on to discuss the topic of strange creatures. He's not just a fan of cryptids. He's taken on the role of investigative journalist, researcher, author, producer. The fact that he's so well known, and because he's been investigating this phenomenon so long, there's very few people that see more reports on this stuff. Not only that, as I remarked before, he's usually there in person, talking to witnesses face to face where these encounters take place. And that's huge because though it doesn't necessarily mean more hard answers about the phenomenon, it definitely gives us more insight into those that witness them, as well as the environments themselves. Because I don't really view cryptids any differently than I do other subjects we discuss here on the Aether. I don't see any evidence that confirms these creatures as being merely undiscovered species of animals. Quite the contrary, the more you look into cryptids, the more you notice all the other high strangeness that gets frequently reported alongside UFOs, the paranormal, and altered states. So again, this comes full circle back to human consciousness. Are we projecting these things? Are we playing some role in co-creating them? Have these things always been here, but only certain people under the right conditions are able to see or interact with them? It isn't just the high strange elements that cryptids share with other phenomena. We also have to look at the cause and effect here. Time after time, we see that people come away from these experiences with a completely different view of the world and what is possible. Whatever they are, they change human perception just like everything else we talk about here. That's significant. Regardless what they are or where they come from, they change us. They force us to see everything in radically different ways. And once again, if part of being human is to grow and evolve, could some larger force be at play here that employs whatever it needs to in order to help us do that? If you believe that we're spiritual beings, what else is part of that realm? Who's to say that only human beings are part of it? Because consciousness exists outside of the physical body, that means we ourselves are metaphysical beings. We're not just flesh and bones, so there is no real argument that definitively says the world we live in, with all its inhabitants, are purely physical. Why would that rule only apply to us? Yes, we can try to capture these things on camera, cast footprints, knock on trees, collect hair samples, but no physical evidence is going to account for why we encounter these things. Physical evidence doesn't tell the whole story. Even if we can prove that some of these creatures exist, where does that leave us? All that does is create more questions we're not equipped to answer until we can better understand the observer. That's it for Season 3, Episode 5, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. You can pick up Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries from the Mire on Amazon or wherever else books are sold. I really can't recommend it enough. Make sure to check out lyleblackburn.com. You'll find all of his work there, including his other books and movies. Everything Lyle puts his stamp on is of the highest quality. You won't be disappointed. I want to remind everybody quickly that the Aether still needs your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, okay? Now more than ever, even if you don't have an iPhone, a Mac, or a MacBook, the app is still available for Windows, and it only takes a couple minutes to drop in and leave your feedback. Every rating and every review helps us reach more people and expand our audience. If you enjoy the show, chances are there are others out there that will too. They just haven't found us yet, and I could really use your help to reach them. It's also a huge help to follow us on Spotify. We're on all the major platforms. I just updated the YouTube channel finally, so it has all the current episodes to date. So yeah, make sure and subscribe to that. We're on Facebook, of course, and I recently changed the Instagram handle. It's no longer Aether_show. It's now Aether_podcast. A little easier to remember, and that's definitely where we're most active. Would love to see you there, and I welcome any and all comments. If you have a story you'd like to share, reach out on social media or email theaethershow@gmail.com. We've got another incredible guest lined up for the next episode, so definitely stay tuned for that. That one should be out here within the next week or so, but I'll make sure to keep you posted via Facebook and Instagram. Thanks again for joining me, guys. We'll see you next time in the Aether.